The courtroom smelled of old wood, polished too many times a gloss that could not hide the cracks in the benches or the yellowing lights above. I was 36 years old, standing stiff in my plain navy suit, palms damp against the papers I clutched when the words sliced through the silence like a blade. "You bankrupted us, Margaret Ross," my stepmother shrieked across the aisle, her voice shrill and venomous, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Even now, after 2 decades, she clung to that accusation like a holy scripture. My breath caught in my throat, and for a heartbeat the world around me collapsed into memory. I was 16 again, shivering on the porch of the house I had once called home. A black garbage bag digging into the crook of my arm, stuffed with clothes too small and shoes too worn. The January wind slapped my face raw, and behind the locked door I heard the click of the chain sliding into place. The birthday candles my classmates enjoyed each year, the laughter of friends in warm kitchens, the ordinary rituals of turning 16, those were denied to me. What I received instead was exile. Margaret had stood in the doorway, then her silhouette framed by the golden light of the living room pearls glinting at her throat. "You bankrupted us, Catherine. Get out!" Her hand shot forward, shoving the garbage bag into my chest as if I were a thief caught red-handed. Behind her, my father, Daniel Ross, lingered in the shadows, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floorboards. He did not speak not a word in my defense. His silence, heavier than any sentence, told me everything I needed to know. I was no longer a daughter. I was a burden discarded like the trash I held. That night, the frost cut through my thin jacket, and each step away from the porch felt like I was peeling away the last remnants of family. I remember staring down at the bag in my arms, its black plastic shiny under the porch light, and thinking, "This is what I am worth. Trash." That memory seared into my bones, roared back as Margaret spat those same words in court, her eyes burning with the same fury that had followed me for 20 years. She had aged, yes, her once perfectly coiffed hair, now streaked with silver, her skin lined with bitterness, but her cruelty had not dulled. She wore it proudly like perfume, too strong, choking the air. My chest tightened as the past and present fused. The polished oak tables, the shuffle of papers, the bored cough of a clerk, all faded, leaving only her words, her condemnation. I had lived under that curse for so long that it had become my truth. For years I believed her lies. I believed I had drained the family dry with hospital bills, that my father's weariness and our modest home were my fault, that every dollar spent to keep me alive was a debt I could never repay. I worked like a shadow, kept my head low, never asked for more than crumbs because deep down I thought Margaret was right, that I had bankrupted them. Now here in this courtroom at 36, I realized the cruel symmetry the same words hurled at me, then hurled again now. But what Margaret did not know, what she could never have anticipated, was that this day would not end like that night. Back then, I had walked into the dark with nothing but a garbage bag. Today, I stood here with documents, with truth, with a name that could no longer be erased. The same venomous accusation she had used to destroy me would soon turn back on her, and the garbage bag that once symbolized my worthlessness would become the banner of my survival. She thought she could bury me in shame forever, but evidence does not blink and paper remembers. My name is Catherine Ross, and for 20 years I believed I was the reason my family fell apart. Margaret's words were not simply cruel insults thrown in anger. They were a mantra drilled into me until they became my inner voice. From the time I could understand language, she told me that every pill, every hospital stay, every doctor's appointment had siphoned away my father's future. She would wave papers in my face, hospital statements with numbers circled in red ink medical charts filled with jargon I could not understand, and hiss, "Look what you cost us." She turned bills into weapons, the kind of weapons that cut deeper than fists because they lodged in the mind. And each time she said it, my father, Daniel Ross, stood silent. His silence was not neutral. It was endorsement. To a child, desperate for his protection, his refusal to speak was worse than any word. It meant he agreed. I grew up convinced that my existence was an equation written in red money, lost opportunities, squandered dreams forfeited. When other children in town talked about birthday parties at roller rinks or vacations to the lake, I stayed quiet. I knew I was the reason we never had them. Margaret made sure I knew. Other kids have parents who can afford those things, she sneered once her nails tapping against the counter. We can't thanks to you. I swallowed those words whole and carried them like stones in my stomach. They weighed down every choice I made. When teachers encouraged me to join clubs, I refused. How could I waste money on uniforms or trips when I had already cost so much? When classmates talked about college, I looked away. College meant tuition, and tuition meant more debt because of me. I lived in the margins believing I owed the world penance for simply surviving. Margaret's manipulation was not only about money, it was about worth. She needed me to believe I was defective a liability so she could justify what she did, and I believed it so completely that it seeped into my posture, my voice, my very breath. I walked, small-spoke, soft, apologized for occupying space. I thought if I could shrink myself enough, maybe I could stop taking. Maybe then she would stop hating me. My father's silence reinforced the narrative. Daniel Ross, a man who worked long hours at the feed mill, came home each night exhausted eyes glazed from fatigue and avoidance. He never said the words Margaret used, but he didn't need to. His downcast eyes at dinner, the way he pushed receipts into Margaret's hands, the way he let her speak for both of them, those silences carved deeper than accusations. They told me I was guilty and that guilt hardened into the only truth I knew. By the time I turned 16, I didn't just believe I had bankrupted them. I believed I had bankrupted love itself. That is why, when Margaret shoved the garbage bag into my chest and pushed me out the door, I didn't scream, I didn't fight, I didn't beg. I thought I deserved it. And for the next 2 decades, that false belief guided every step I took, every job I accepted, every dream I buried. It was a prison with invisible walls built from the words of a woman who wanted me gone and the silence of a man who let her. When I think of my childhood, it does not come back in the bright colors of cartoons or birthday balloons. It comes in fragments of paper, the edges curled and smudged with ink. Hospital bills and receipts Margaret would slap onto the kitchen table as if they were verdicts in a trial where I was always the defendant. I was 8 the first time she shoved a paper toward me, numbers circled in angry red pen. "Do you see this?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to sting. "That's what your little surgery cost us, $10,000. Do you have any idea how much that is?" Of course I didn't. I was 8. I only knew the way her lips curled when she said it, as if my existence was a sin she was forced to carry. My father Daniel sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, his jaw tight. He didn't correct her. He didn't tell me it wasn't my fault. He just stared down at the wood grain of the table as if the knots and lines were more deserving of his attention than his daughter's shame. That silence was worse than Margaret's venom because it told me she was right. Margaret's words became the air I breathed. At school, when teachers handed out flyers for field trips, I crumpled mine before even bringing it home. I could already hear Margaret's sneer. "We don't have money for nonsense like this. Do you think money grows on trees?" When other kids boasted about their new clothes or shiny shoes, I kept my head low, tugging at my hand-me-downs, remembering Margaret's hissed warning. "You're lucky we clothe you at all, Catherine. You eat the money right out of our pockets." Those lies sank into my bones, reshaping me. By 12, I had memorized the script. If I wanted to ask for anything, I rehearsed apologies first. I learned to measure every desire against Margaret's ledger of debts. A school dance too expensive. A book from the fair, selfish, a new backpack impossible, and behind every denied request stood my father's silence, his weary nod as Margaret snapped her verdict. He was there, always there, but never for me. The house itself seemed to echo Margaret's control. The living room glowed warm, filled with laughter from her 2 children, my half-siblings, who sprawled across the couch with their sodas and snacks. I hovered at the kitchen threshold, careful not to cross the invisible line. The kitchen was mine, the dishes stacked high, the floor that always needed scrubbing, the smell of bleach that burned my nose. Margaret liked to remind me that chores were my contribution, my penance. "It's only fair," she said, pressing a mop into my hands while her daughter flipped channels on the television. "You cost us more than enough. At least you can clean." My hands cracked from soap and water, my knees bruised from scrubbing tiles, but I said nothing. I thought she was right. At night, when the house went quiet, I would curl up in my narrow bed, the springs squeaking, and listen to the muffled laughter drifting from the living room. Sometimes I pressed a pillow over my head, but it never drowned out the sound of belonging I was denied. Margaret's manipulation was not just financial, it was emotional warfare. She made me believe I was outside the circle of family, peering in through glass that could never be broken. She crafted an identity for me, the unwanted child, the burden, the reason for every struggle. And my father's silence sealed it like wax on a decree. Once, when I was about 13, I found a photo album on the shelf filled with pictures of family vacations before I was born. Beaches, campgrounds, smiling faces under summer skies. I brought it to the table, my voice tentative. "Why don't we do things like this anymore?" Margaret snatched the album from my hands, her eyes cold. "Because of you," she said, simply snapping it shut. My father shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, but said nothing. That was the moment I stopped asking questions. That was the moment I accepted her answer as truth. My childhood was not measured in birthdays or milestones. It was measured in accusations, in bills waved like flags of war, in silences that cut deeper than words. It was a childhood under siege, and I was the enemy inside my own home. My 16th birthday should have been a threshold, a day marked by freedom, a driver's license, maybe a cake with candles. But in the Ross household, milestones did not belong to me. That January morning, the sky hung low, heavy with gray clouds, and the air carried a sharp edge that cut through my thin sweater. I remember thinking how still the house was, no scent of baking, no sign of celebration. Instead, Margaret's heels clicked against the hardwood floor like a metronome of dread. She called me to the living room, her voice flat stripped of even the fake sweetness she sometimes used when guests were present. "Bring your things," she said. My heart stumbled. I looked at my father Daniel, who sat in his worn armchair, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand. He did not look at me. He stared at the steam curling upward as if it contained answers he could not bear to say. I went to my room, confusion pressing against my ribs, and found a black garbage bag already tossed on the bed. Margaret had beaten me to it. Clothes folded carelessly, some too small, some stained, were stuffed inside. My shoes mismatched, my school notebooks bent, all crammed together in plastic. I ran my hand across the bag, the slick plastic crinkling under my touch, and felt humiliation rise in my throat like bile. I carried the bag into the living room where Margaret stood waiting, her lips painted a hard red, her pearl necklace gleaming in the weak light. She took one step closer and thrust the bag against my chest. "You bankrupted us, Catherine. Get out!" Her words struck harder than her shove, a sentence delivered without appeal. I looked at my father, then desperate for contradiction, for the smallest sign that he would not let this happen. But Daniel only pressed his mug to his lips, though I could see his hand tremble. He kept his eyes fixed on the wall. The silence between us was louder than Margaret's venom. It told me he agreed, or worse, that he was too weak to care. Something inside me cracked. 16 years old, old enough to drive, but not old enough to survive alone. I stood there with the garbage bag digging into my arms. The house I had scrubbed and cleaned, the dishes I had washed, the floors I had polished until my hands bled, all of it dissolved behind me. I wanted to scream to demand why, but the words died in my throat. I believed them. I believed I deserved it. Margaret yanked open the front door, and a blast of icy wind rushed in, swirling around my ankles. The world outside looked gray and endless. She pushed me forward, her nails biting into my shoulder, and with one last shove, I stumbled onto the porch. The garbage bag thumped against my side. The door slammed behind me, the metallic scrape of the chain sliding into place, sealing my exile. I stood there, breath puffing white in the cold air, my heart hammering. Snowflakes drifted down, melting against my cheeks, mixing with the hot sting of tears I could not hold back. I looked at the bag in my arms. The black plastic gleamed under the porch light, reflecting me back in warped fragments. Trash. That was what I was to them. Across the street, a neighbor's window glowed with birthday candles, laughter spilling into the night. I clutched the bag tighter, not because it held anything of worth, but because it was the only thing left tethering me to what I had called home. The walk down the driveway felt endless, each step crunching on the frozen ground like the sound of something breaking inside me. By the time I reached the street, the house loomed behind me, its windows dark, its door locked, its warmth withheld forever. 16 years of belonging, however flawed, ended in a single night with a shove and a bag of cast-offs. I did not look back. I couldn't. To look back would have been to beg, and I had already been told what I was worth. The first night after I was thrown out blurred into the second, then into weeks that stretched like an endless winter. At 16, I had nowhere to go, no friends close enough to take me in, and certainly no relatives willing to cross Margaret. I found myself on a park bench, the garbage bag tucked under my arm, like a grotesque pillow, the hard wood pressing into my spine. The cold sank into my bones, each gust of wind a reminder that I no longer belonged anywhere. Hunger gnawed at me until it hollowed my stomach. I scavenged through church pantries, grateful for stale bread or soup ladled into paper cups by volunteers who never asked too many questions. I learned quickly to keep my eyes down, to say thank you softly, to disappear into the shuffle of the needy. Shame became my shadow, following me everywhere. During the day, I searched for work, but what employer would hire a 16-year-old with no address and no guardian to sign papers? Eventually, I found odd jobs washing dishes in the back of a greasy diner, sweeping floors at a corner store, scrubbing toilets in places that smelled of bleach and despair. My hands cracked and bled, the skin raw from chemicals. The managers barked at me, sometimes tossed my pay and coins onto the floor, just to watch me scramble. I never complained. I thought I deserved every insult. Margaret's words had done their work. "You bankrupted us." Those 3 words became the chorus in my head. When customers sneered at me for moving too slowly, I agreed silently. When coworkers laughed behind my back, I thought, of course, I am the reason families suffer. I am the reason my father lives small. Every humiliation fit neatly into the story Margaret had written for me, a story where I was always guilty. Nights were the hardest. I would return to whichever shelter had a free cot, or sometimes back to the same bench, hugging the garbage bag like a lifeline. The clothes inside grew musty, the notebooks bent and torn, but I could not let it go. That bag was the last piece of the house I had been cast from, the proof that once I had belonged somewhere, even if I had been expelled. I pressed my cheek to it as though it could remind me of who I was. Instead, it whispered back the lie, "You are nothing." I carried that bag from one place to another, through alleys that smelled of urine, through streets lit by neon signs buzzing faintly. It was both my burden and my shield. People looked at me and saw a girl with nothing. They weren't wrong, but what they didn't know was that inside I carried Margaret's sentence, and I had accepted it. At 17, I picked up a second job bussing tables at a rundown bar where the patrons pinched and cursed and sometimes left without paying. At 18, I mopped the floors of an office building at night, inhaling the sharp sting of ammonia until my head swam. At 19, I was still in the same cycle work, eat just enough to keep going, sleep wherever I could. College was a foreign word, a dream for other people. I could barely think beyond the next day's meal. The years slid by, indistinguishable, marked only by the new cracks on my knuckles and the deep ache in my back. By my early 20s, I had grown used to invisibility. People walked past me on sidewalks as though I were a shadow. I rarely looked in mirrors. I didn't want to see the proof of what Margaret had declared. Sometimes I wondered if my father thought of me. Did Daniel ever regret letting the door close on me that night? Did he ever look at Margaret and see the cruelty she wielded so freely? But I always stopped those thoughts. Regret was for people who mattered. I had convinced myself I did not. The lie Margaret told had become my truth. I did not chase after hope because I believed I had already squandered the chance to deserve it. I buried myself in labor, scrubbing, lifting, carrying, always apologizing when I wasn't fast enough. My paychecks vanished on cheap rent for rooms that smelled of mold, on instant noodles that filled my belly but not my soul. And still, I clutched the garbage bag, moving it from place to place as if letting it go would erase the last evidence that I had ever been part of a family. It was my brand of shame, a brand I wore willingly. I lived this way for years, each day a copy of the one before, until the calendar blurred. 20 years passed in the rhythm of survival. By then, I was 36 alive, but emptied a woman molded by exile and silence. I had no idea the story Margaret had written for me was about to be torn apart by the truth. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the smallest kindness cracked through the shell I had built around myself. I was 21 then, 5 years into the life Margaret had sentenced me to working double shifts at a laundromat that smelled perpetually of damp clothes and detergent. My fingers were raw, the skin between them split, and I had not eaten a full meal in days. That was when Helen Ward walked in. At first, I thought she was just another customer, middle-aged with kind eyes hidden behind square glasses, a tote bag slung over her shoulder. But she didn't hand me quarters or shove a basket at me. She asked my name. No one had asked me that in weeks, maybe months. I mumbled it wary, ready for the disdain that usually followed. But Helen smiled soft and steady and said, "Catherine, you look tired. Do you have someone to help you?" I froze. Help was not a word in my vocabulary. Survival? Yes. Endure? Yes. But help, no. Still something in her tone, gentle but firm, made me nod. She asked if I had eaten. I lied and said yes, but my stomach betrayed me with a growl so loud it felt like a confession. Helen didn't laugh. She simply handed me a sandwich from her tote. "Take it," she said. "It's extra." I ate it in 2 bites, shame burning my cheeks, but she didn't scold or pity me. She just sat across from me while the washers hummed. That day was the beginning. Helen Ward was a social worker who spent her afternoons visiting places where the forgotten gathered. Shelters, food banks, laundromats. She explained that her job was not charity, it was connection. And for reasons I didn't understand, she saw something in me worth connecting to. She came back the next week, and the week after, always with food, always with questions that cut past the surface. "What do you want to do?" she asked one evening as I folded clothes. I laughed bitterly. "Want I just work?" "No," she said, her voice steady. "I asked what you want." The question rattled me. No one had asked me that since I was a child before Margaret's words erased my ability to dream. For weeks, I dodged it, but Helen was patient. She didn't push, just kept showing up. Slowly, I began to answer. At first, with small things, I want a bed that isn't borrowed. I want shoes that fit. Then bigger, I want to finish high school. Maybe even get a certificate. Helen never flinched. She nodded scribbled notes, found resources. One day, she pressed a pamphlet into my hands for a GED program. "You're smart, Catherine," she said. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Her faith in me felt like foreign currency. I didn't know how to spend it, but I tucked it into my pocket like treasure. Through Helen, I met others who lived outside the walls of traditional families, men and women cast out for reasons as cruel as mine: poverty, abuse, rejection. In their company, I felt something I hadn't in years: belonging. It wasn't the kind of family I had been born into. It was the kind I chose, or maybe the kind that chose me. Helen reminded me over and over of one truth that became my anchor. You are not a burden. You never were. The first time she said it, I cried. Not dainty tears, but gut-wrenching sobs that left me shaking. She didn't look away. She held my hands, rough and cracked as they were, and let me weep. That sentence became the counterspell to Margaret's curse. It didn't erase 20 years of lies, but it began to loosen their grip. I was still the girl with a garbage bag in her past, but maybe, just maybe, I was not destined to carry it forever. By the time I turned 36, survival had become second nature. I worked steady shifts at a downtown office cleaning service, rented a small apartment that smelled faintly of paint, and had managed to piece together a fragile stability. It wasn't glamorous, but after 2 decades of scraping, it felt like an empire built on my own exhausted hands. That was when the phone rang. I remember it clearly: a Thursday evening, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence of my kitchen as I reheated leftover noodles. My cell phone buzzed the number unknown. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Calls from strangers rarely carried good news. But something in me pressed answer. "Ms. Catherine Ross," a man's voice asked, deep and precise. "Yes," I said, slowly wary. "This is Charles Bennett. I'm an attorney. I represent the estate of William Ross." My fork clattered against the counter. William Ross. My grandfather. A name I hadn't spoken aloud in years, a man who had been more myth than presence in my childhood. "I think you must have the wrong person," I managed. My voice was thin, brittle. "I don't have family." "Not anymore." "No," Ms. Ross Bennett said firmly. "I assure you this is correct. Your grandfather recently passed. His estate requires your presence for the reading of the trust." My knees buckled. I sank into a chair noodles, forgotten the words tangling in my head. Grandfather, trust, estate. These were words from another world, a world I had been exiled from with a garbage bag and a shove. "I don't understand," I whispered. Bennett's tone softened. "I imagine you wouldn't, but you are listed as a primary beneficiary. I will need you at probate court this Monday morning, 10 o'clock. The call ended with details I barely absorbed. My hands shook as I set the phone down, my chest tight, my pulse racing. Questions flooded me louder than the hum of the fridge. Why me? Why now? Had Margaret manipulated this too, somehow twisting the truth as she had always done? Did my father know the ghosts of their voices crowded my kitchen? Margaret's scorn, Daniel's silence, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the garbage bag pressing against me again, heavy and suffocating. I called Helen that night. She listened quietly as I stammered through the story, my disbelief spilling out like broken glass. When I finished, she said simply, "Catherine, this is your truth, not theirs. Maybe it's time it finally comes to light." Her words settled in me like a spark in dry tinder. For 2 decades, I had accepted Margaret's lie, lived beneath its shadow. Now, a stranger's voice had cracked the silence, offering a chance terrifying, impossible to rewrite everything. I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window, the city lights glowing faintly behind me, and wondered who I would be when Monday came. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, a mix of history and judgment pressed into every corner. I sat at a long oak table, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. Across the room, Margaret swept in her pearls, gleaming her lips, painted a defiant scarlet. Daniel shuffled behind her. Smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped as if time had pressed him into half his size. They did not look at me. I felt the old familiar sting of invisibility, but this time I was not 16. I was 36, and the weight in my chest was not shame. It was anticipation. Charles Bennett cleared his throat, his voice filling the chamber with the steadiness of a man who had delivered truths many times before. "We are here today to settle the estate of William Ross," he began. He glanced at me briefly, a flicker of reassurance, then returned to the documents in front of him. Margaret sat tall, her chin high, as if victory were already hers. Bennett unfolded the first page. "To my son, Daniel Ross, I leave the home on Hawthorne Street, the place he was raised in, hopes he will find peace there." Daniel nodded faintly, his eyes darting to Margaret. She offered him no smile. "To my daughter-in-law, Margaret Ross." Bennett paused, his voice sharp with precision. "I leave nothing." The words dropped like a gavel. Gasps echoed from the back of the room, where distant relatives had gathered curious as vultures. Margaret's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. She leaned forward, her voice a hiss. "This is a mistake." Bennett ignored her and turned another page. "And to my granddaughter, Catherine Ross, I leave the remainder of my estate consisting of all liquid assets, investments, and trusts totaling $93 million. The air thickened. My ears rang, my breath caught. 93 million. The number sounded unreal, like syllables strung together with no meaning. I sat frozen, unable to move as the world tilted. Margaret erupted. "Absolutely not! She's nothing! She bankrupted us!" Her voice cut through the chamber, shrill, desperate. All eyes turned to her. Bennett's gaze was steel. "Mrs. Ross, the will is clear. William Ross established this trust 20 years ago in the event of his death. He made no amendments. Catherine Ross is the sole beneficiary." Margaret slammed her palm on the table. "He didn't know the truth. Daniel's heart condition, the debt we lost, everything because of her." She jabbed a manicured finger at me, her voice cracking. "That girl is poison." Bennett adjusted his glasses. "The records show otherwise. Daniel's medical bills were paid in full by insurance. The supposed debt was manufactured. In fact, Mrs. Ross, we have evidence you diverted nearly $2 million of those insurance funds into a private account in your maiden name. William Ross discovered this, which is precisely why he ensured the estate bypassed you entirely." The room went silent. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, words failing her for the first time in my memory. Daniel's face crumpled, his eyes darting between us, shame carving deep lines into his skin. I felt heat rush to my face, not from humiliation, but from a wave of vindication so fierce it stole my breath. For 20 years, I had carried her sentence like a brand, and now in black and white, the truth glared back at her. I had not bankrupted anyone. She had. Margaret surged to her feet, voice wild. "She doesn't deserve it. She's worthless." I stood too, my legs steady beneath me, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. "I was 16 when you threw me out with nothing but a garbage bag, Margaret, and you told me I ruined you. But it was you all along." My words hung in the air, quiet but undeniable. The judge rapped his gavel, demanding order. Margaret's protests devolved into shrieks, but they no longer reached me. I turned my gaze to Bennett, who nodded once firmly and repeated $93 million to Catherine Ross. For the first time in 20 years, I inhaled without guilt. The garbage bag I had carried in memory no longer held power over me. The lie was dead. The truth had been set free. The gavel's echo had barely faded when Margaret spun toward me, eyes blazing, the pearls at her throat quivering with each furious breath. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice sharp enough to slice glass. "You may have tricked him, but you'll never be one of us. You were never family." I rose slowly, my palms pressed against the polished wood of the table, steadying myself. For so long, those words would have pierced straight through me, but now, after the truth lay bare in ink and signatures, they felt hollow. I lifted my chin. "I never needed to be one of you," I said. My voice was calm, but each syllable carried 20 years of weight. What I needed was the truth, and I finally have it. Daniel shifted in his seat, his face gray, his hands trembling against his knees. For the first time, he looked directly at me. "Catherine." His voice cracked weak and uncertain. "I didn't know. I thought Margaret said, 'Enough,'" I cut in, not harsh but firm. "You thought nothing. You let her speak for you. You let her define me, and you let me walk out that door when I was 16. You stood there while she shoved a garbage bag into my hands and told me I ruined your lives." My throat tightened, but I didn't falter. "You watched your daughter disappear, and you said nothing." His eyes filled, but I saw no strength behind them, only years of silent complicity. I was sick. I was scared. "You were my father," I interrupted again, "and you chose silence." A murmur rippled through the room. Relatives leaned closer, catching every word. Even the judge's gavel stilled, as though the confrontation itself deserved space. Margaret barked a laugh, brittle and cruel. "Oh, listen to her playing the victim. Do you think money changes what you are? Trash with cash is still trash." I turned fully towards her, meeting her glare. For 2 decades, that sentence, the trash bag, the curse had caged me. But now it was different. "You're wrong," I said quietly. "That bag was never trash. It was proof. Proof I survived everything you threw at me. Proof you couldn't erase me. You called me garbage, Margaret, but look at me now. I'm the one still standing, and you're the one exposed." Her mouth snapped shut, her fury collapsing into silence she could no longer twist into power. I faced the judge, then my voice even. "Your Honor, I don't want theatrics. I don't want vengeance, but I want this on the record. I did not bankrupt anyone. The only thing I ever carried from that house was a black garbage bag, and for 20 years it was enough to keep me alive. Today, it is enough to remind me that survival can turn into strength." The judge nodded gravely, duly noted. Bennett leaned close, his whisper steady. "You did well. You said what needed to be said." I sat back down, my body trembling not with fear, but release. Margaret sagged into her chair, her face twisted with a rage she could no longer weaponize. Daniel stared at the floor, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. For the first time, the silence belonged to me. And it was not the silence of abandonment, it was the silence of victory. When the hearing ended, the courthouse emptied in waves, distant cousins whispering, reporters circling like moths to flame the judge retreating behind his chambers. But Daniel remained in his seat, shoulders hunched, hands clutching his knees as if they were the only things keeping him tethered. Margaret stormed out ahead, her heels cracking against the marble, her muttering a trail of venom no one cared to follow. "Wait," Daniel said finally, his voice a rasp. I paused by the doorway, the new weight of $93 million still abstract, hovering in the air like something unreal. Slowly I turned back. His eyes lifted to mine, red-rimmed wet. "Catherine," he whispered, as if my name were both a confession and a plea. "I failed you." The words struck me harder than Margaret's shrieks ever had, because they came late, 2 decades too late. I stood still, the echoes of my 16-year-old self hovering like a ghost between us. "I thought I was dying back then," he continued, his voice unsteady. "My heart, the bills, I was terrified. Margaret told me you were selfish, that you cost us everything. I was weak and I let her voice drown out my own." He swallowed, shaking. "I should have protected you. I should have stopped her that night." Images flashed the garbage bag in my hands, the porch light casting long shadows, his silhouette behind Margaret's sharp frame. Silent, motionless. The man who had been my father turning into a statue as I walked into the dark. "You didn't stop her," I said quietly. My voice did not waver. "You watched." He flinched as if the truth itself were a blow. "I know, and I've lived with that shame every day since. Catherine, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I loved you. I was just too weak to show it." The words landed, but they didn't heal. Love without action was as useless as silence. I looked at him, really looked at the lines carved deep into his face, the weight of decades pressing his frame down. He was not the towering figure of my childhood anymore. He was a man broken by choices, by fear, by the woman beside him. "I wanted you to fight for me," I whispered. "Just once, but you never did." Tears slid down his cheeks, slow and heavy. "I'm sorry," he breathed. "I'm so sorry." For a moment I let the silence stretch. The courtroom was nearly empty, the scent of wood polish fading the air thick with everything unsaid. Finally, I nodded. "I believe you regret it, but regret doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase 20 years of my life." His shoulders sagged, his breath shuddering. He understood this was not absolution, not a clean slate. It was acknowledgement and nothing more. Behind us, the door slammed. Margaret reappeared, her face pale, her eyes sharp with fury and desperation. But she said nothing this time. Her power had been stripped, her lies exposed. For the first time in memory, she looked small. I turned from them both, stepping into the light of the hallway. The truth was mine, now not theirs. And though regret lingered behind me like a shadow, it no longer dictated my steps. 2 years later, I no longer flinched when I passed a black garbage bag on the sidewalk. Where once it had been a symbol of shame, now it had become something else entirely, a reminder of how far I had come and what I had built. At 38, the inheritance was no longer just numbers in an account. $93 million had transformed into bricks and mortar, into classrooms and counseling centers, into hands reaching for other hands. We called it the Garbage Bag Foundation because I refused to let the insult that once defined me remain an open wound. Instead, I stitched it into a banner of survival. The first building opened on a brisk spring morning. Children lined the entrance, their coats too thin for the chill, their eyes carrying that same mix of fear and hunger I remembered in my own reflection decades earlier. Volunteers handed out hot cocoa, while Helen Ward, who had never once stopped believing in me, stood at my side, her hand steady on my shoulder. "This is yours," she whispered as the ribbon was cut, as applause filled the street. "Not just the building, the hope. You made this." I smiled, though tears blurred the crowd before me. For years, I had survived by cleaning offices no one noticed existing in shadows. Now people were looking at me with gratitude instead of pity, with trust instead of doubt. Inside the foundation pulsed with life. One wing offered tutoring for teenagers pushed out of school systems. Another housed counselors trained to guide kids who had been abandoned or rejected, helping them navigate trauma that might otherwise consume them. We even had a small dormitory for those with nowhere safe to sleep. Every detail mattered to me, the sturdy locks on the doors, so no one would feel unsafe. The bright paint on the walls, so no one would feel forgotten. Even the laundry room carried a piece of me stocked with fresh clothes and soap because I remembered too clearly the sting of wearing the same shirt day after day, invisible yet exposed. Reporters came, of course. They wanted the headline, "Estranged Heiress Turns Inheritance into Hope." But when they asked me about Margaret or Daniel, I shook my head. "This isn't about them," I said firmly. "This is about the kids who need to know they are not disposable, who need to know that a garbage bag doesn't define them." The words spread, picked up in articles whispered across communities. Soon donations arrived, not because people pitied me, but because they believed in what we were doing. The inheritance had lit the flame, but others brought fuel, and the fire grew. One evening, after the last of the kids had gone to bed, I walked through the halls alone. The building smelled faintly of fresh paint and soap, but also of something deeper, safety belonging. My footsteps echoed steady, sure. For the first time, I felt like I had built not just a home, but a future. Sometimes I thought of Daniel. He had written letters, apologies, rambling admissions of fear and weakness, but I rarely opened them. Regret was his to carry. I had chosen not to let it chain me anymore. As for Margaret, she faded into silence after the scandal of her exposed theft. Once her voice had filled every corner of my life. Now it was only an echo, powerless and distant. Instead, I listened to new voices, the laughter of children, the gratitude of parents, the steady encouragement of Helen, who had become more family than blood ever gave me. On the foundation's one-year anniversary, I stood before a group of teenagers clutching duffel bags and backpacks, their eyes darting with suspicion and hope. I told them the truth. Once, someone handed me a garbage bag and told me it was all I deserved. But look around you, walls, lights, warmth. None of this was trash, and neither are you. You are worth more than you know. They listened. Some cried. And in that moment, I knew the transformation was complete. I had taken the lie that tried to destroy me and turned it into a lifeline for others. At 38, I was not just an heiress. I was a survivor, a builder, a woman who had redefined what family could mean. And for the first time, I felt whole. The night before our second shelter opened, I sat alone in my living room, the city lights twinkling through the tall windows. On the table beside me sat a simple cloth tote black with white stitching. Across the fabric, embroidered in bold thread, were the words, "Garbage Bag Foundation." I ran my hand over the letters, feeling the texture beneath my fingertips. Once a garbage bag had been my exile. Now it was my flag. I had carried it out of my childhood home filled with the scraps of a life discarded. 22 years later, I had carried its memory into something that could never again be torn apart by lies. I thought of the girl I had been 16 standing on the curb, with her arms wrapped around a bag of clothes, shivering, crying, believing every word Margaret spat that I was worthless, that I had destroyed my father, that I was the burden breaking the family apart. For years, I had lived under the shadow of that sentence, and for years, my father's silence had made me believe it. But silence is no longer my story. Now the voices I hear are those of children laughing in safe dormitories, of counselors telling them "you matter," of Helen reminding me that survival is not shameful but sacred. Even the silence feels different. It is peace, not punishment. Daniel's letters still arrive, sometimes trembling scrawls across yellowed paper. I keep them in a drawer. Perhaps one day I will open them all, but I no longer ache for words he never gave me when they mattered most. Regret belongs to him. My life belongs to me. Margaret's name surfaces occasionally in whispers, legal hearings, debts unpaid, a reputation permanently cracked. Yet she too no longer defines me. For decades, she tried to cast me as trash. The irony is simple. Her cruelty gave me the very symbol I used to build something indestructible. I glanced again at the embroidered bag, its threads strong under the lamplight. I smiled. "This was never garbage," I whispered, "and neither was I." When I stepped into the new center the next morning, children were already lining up at the doors, their belongings clutched in plastic bags, pillowcases, boxes, whatever they had managed to grab before leaving homes that had cast them out. I greeted them one by one, placing the black cloth totes in their hands. "This is yours now," I said. "Not trash. Proof you survived." Their eyes lit up, hesitant smiles tugging at lips used to frowns. I saw myself in every face. I saw the journey from exile to return, from silence to voice, from shame to dignity. That was the real inheritance. Not just the money, not even the buildings, but the chance to take pain and make it mean something. As the ribbon fell and the crowd applauded, I stood before them, 38 years old, survivor and builder, no longer invisible. My voice carried steady over the hum of the city. Family is not always the people you're born to. Sometimes it is the people who find you when you're broken and remind you that you're whole. For years, I believed I was worthless because that was the story told to me. But today, I stand here to tell you your story can change. You are not trash. You are proof that survival is strength. The applause rose louder, but what mattered were the eyes wide wet believing. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, I recorded a message for those beyond the walls of the foundation for anyone who might be listening. If you've ever been cast aside, if someone you loved told you that you were nothing, know this, they lied. Worth is not theirs to give or take. It is yours always. I carried a garbage bag once, but today I carry a future. What about you? Have you ever been betrayed by the ones who should have protected you? Share your story, because in speaking it, you'll find you were never alone. And with that, the cycle closed, not with vengeance, but with justice, not with silence, but with truth. I was Catherine Ross, once the girl with the garbage bag. Now I was something more unbroken,